Hello everyone, good evening. Welcome to the Council briefing of the 7th of March 2023. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation and pay our respects to elders past and present. In terms of apologies and members on leave of absence, we haven't received any apologies this evening. Okay, so we're accepting apologies then from Councillor Suzanne Warner due to medical reasons, and then we will move straight to public question time and receiving of public statements. So welcome members of the community to our meeting. For those who may not have been here on another occasion, we just ask that if you do wish to speak to an item that you just come up to the microphone. There's no set order. We just ask that you state your name, the suburb that you live in and or work in if it's related to your role as an employment in the city of Vincent, and that you let us know the number that you're talking to this evening. And if you can't pick it out, I can help you with that. So question time is open. Whoever would like to come forward first, please come up to the microphone. Thank you, John.
I hope I've got the right order here. I'd like to speak on item 8.4. That was a motion that was put at the electors meeting, motion 4.14. Is this the correct time?
Yes, John, that's right. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's get my glasses. I put forward at the electors meeting that a new conservation plan be commissioned for Hyde Park. And the council, I notice, has supported my motion. So thank you very, very much for that. But I just want to talk about why a conservation plan is very, very important as such. It was done in 2003 as a result of Hyde Park going onto the State Register for Heritage Places in 1998, 18 years ago. And it meant that this council could actually apply for heritage funding. And to my knowledge, it never has. So there's been a pool of money there for projects, documentation, and many other things as such. And a conservation plan is important, and it makes recommendations and guidelines contained within it for the purposes of retaining and conserving the cultural heritage significance of Hyde Park. Now, that's different to just your normal grassed areas, your public open spaces as such. And on page 149 of the conservation plan, it actually sets out 12 points of the cultural significance of Hyde Park. I just want to go to the very first one. And it says, the cultural significance of Hyde Park, a well-composed example of a Federation-era park that exhibits elements of the earlier Victorian garden-esque style, a style that has continued to be used in the landscaping of municipal parks well into the 20th century. So this is a very important aspect of it. It's got cultural significance because of that. And as I said, there's also other points which you can see in the conservation plan. I was one of the co-authors of that document, and I'm very disappointed in many aspects of how Hyde Park has actually been managed, from the horticultural side of it and other management policies. This document has not been used and consulted. That was the very purpose of why it was commissioned and why the former city of Vincent, town of Vincent, ratified it. And it's a managing tool that needs to be consulted. And that's a very important part of the conservation plan. Now, you have supported my motion to revisit that and possibly upgrade it as such. And when the new document is actually commissioned, and I assume it will be advertised and put out for interest, you will want people that have experience within that, i.e. the Heritage Council of WA, professional historical researchers, horticulturalists with heritage experience, heritage architects, arboriculturalists that have worked on heritage, had heritage experience. And you need to have input from other community groups like the WA branch of the Australian Garden History Society, your own local history centre, which is a font of information, and the WA Horticultural Council. So the document is very, very important, and there are major problems in the park now from diseases and pests, which is...
John, you have reached your 3 minutes, so could you just make your concluding comment, please?
Okay. So therefore, the purpose of the conservation plan is that it's used as a working document by the technical staff to guide how the park is managed and its cultural significance is maintained. And it comes through discussions with the author of the conservation plan and technical staff as such. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And also just to correct myself, I had tabled your apologies, Councillor Warner, but I say you're attending online, so it's fantastic to see you. Thank you for joining us online this evening. Next speaker, please. Thank you, John.
Mari Slythe, 89 Carr Street, West Perth, and I wish to speak to the request we put at the AGM, which did get approval at the time or agreed, about creating a cul-de-sac in Strathcona Street to protect our local people from the, well, when Bunnings is finally built, how the impact is going to affect all of us in our streets and change how we live. And we believe that's going to be the case because of we already have further rat running through our precinct, the streets being Florence Street all the time, Carr Street, Strathcona Street, and they also use Hammond Street to get out when they're in a hurry. But this is going to get worse. And we do foresee if there's going to be business being conducted in Bunnings, how are these people going to get there? They're not going to go by main roads. They're going to find the shortest way they can get if they're coming from North Perth, east side, and or West Perth on the other side. They've got to get there. And so we really fear for our future, and this is serious. And it's on a daily basis. We notice how the numbers of traffic are increasing all the time, and they're getting faster. So 30 kilometres an hour is just a joke. I'm sorry. They don't observe that. There's no way. It's not safe. They're going to go as fast as they can to get through the streets they want to get through, including Strathcona Street. That's also supposed to be 30k. Carr Street is now, we watch them go past, be 60, sometimes up to 70, because they're going to get to the traffic lights to get where they've got to go. And it doesn't get less. And now we also have e-bikes zooming along with them as well on the roads. It's really interesting. So no one's been hit yet. But one of the reasons a decision that council made on this was we haven't had any accidents yet. That's sheer miracle, because I come out my front gate and I'm likely to get hit by an e-scooter because I can't see them until I step on the footpath. And it missed me by a whisker about 3 times so far. So anyhow, getting back to the speed limit, if Bunnings trucks do not go through our precinct, that's not proven it will or not yet, but if they don't, how are trucks that need timber from the timber yard at Bunnings going to get back to where they live, say in northeast Perth area? How are they going to do it? They're not going to go to the main roads. They're going to get as fast as they can. So that's still going to affect our streets. And we wonder why council is not doing speeding line tests across these streets, which will let us prove that what we're saying is true. And it just don't take what you get on paper or you believe might be right without coming and checking it for us. And once Bunnings is completed, council will have to provide residents with parking facilities, since there is bound to be an overflow into our local streets from Bunnings customers. At the onset of Bunnings takeover, council did state that adjoining local areas like Cleaver Precinct character area, which we're supposed to be, that's being ruined by increased traffic already, would be looked after. You did tell us that in that initial Bunnings policy you put out. Admin's review statement of a number of crashes, well, as I just mentioned that, we haven't had them. No. So does that mean there's not going to be crashes? I'm not saying there will or won't, but that shouldn't be the decision that council makes, this decision on saying they're not going to let us have a cul-de-sac in Strathcona Street, because we believe that will stop the rat running. And that's why we're putting that to council tonight. I've discussed with a few neighbours the other day or just recently, and they will say, why isn't council helping us? So that's my comments.
Thanks, Mari. You've reached your 3 minutes.
Yes. And the other item I had to speak was
Mari,
the tree.
You have sort of cut yourself short there, because you've spoken for 3 minutes already, but you have provided us with your
You've got that.
words in advance. So we also have that in writing here, and
So
that's
can that be
covering off your
All right.
words in relation to the removal of the tree. So
the tree,
we've got
yep.
that in writing
Can that
here.
be decided on tonight as well?
No, this is the briefing. So
the briefing.
yep, the
That's
council
right, that's
meeting
right.
next
Okay,
week
sure,
will
that's
be
right.
when we make
Okay.
the decision on the
Okay.
motions
That'll be next
response.
Tuesday.
Yep.
Yep. Okay.
Thanks, Murray. Next speaker, please.
Hello, it's Penny Hutchinson from 14 Florence Street. I'm here with at least 5 other residents and 6, including Mari Slice, in relation to the same matter. There are big discussions going on the streets of Florence Street, Hammond Street, Carr Street and Strathcona Street. We're a small representation. We're all quite anxious about the rat running of cars that are already taking place down Florence, onto Carr and then through Strathcona. It would in fact inconvenience the residents living inside of that district to have the cul-de-sac, but we feel that it's an absolute necessity in advance of Bunnings being built, and that any anticipation of, you know, the necessity of an accident to happen prior to the justification for a cul-de-sac to be built is not a sufficient justification in anticipation of Bunnings being built and what's going to happen to the residents inside that small West Perth precinct. We are a small precinct, but we're active and the people are talking about it. We implore you to listen to us, please, and take care of us in relation to this huge Bunnings bombardment that's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Penny. I might just stop and ask a question, but you can answer later. But manager, so I'm looking at manager policy in place in terms of the transport study that is to be undertaken for the Pickle District local planning framework. Would that take into consideration the residential streets on the other side of Newcastle Street? Okay, so perhaps we could look into that because that might be relevant. Thank you. Next speaker, please. Oh, hello, you're already here. Go ahead.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Joshua Carmody from Planning Solutions in Perth, and I'm speaking to you on behalf of Mr. Peroni, who's sitting here, and Ms. Prestopino, who are the landowners of 107 Palmerston Street, which is the 4 strata dwellings, strata units to the southwest of the development, which you'll be looking at tonight under item 5.1. So Mr. Peroni and Ms. Prestopino are deeply concerned about the impact that this development is going to make and the substantial overshadowing that will be caused if it's approved. Now, when I say substantial, what I'm talking about is that 3 of the units on this strata complex will be overshadowed to an extent of greater than 70%, and 1 of them will be overshadowed up to 92%. Now, all these units, these 3 units, will experience overshadowing of the outdoor living areas and north-facing living rooms throughout most of the winter, or throughout the winter. And we understand from Mr. Peroni that this includes the blocking of the daylight access to the bedroom, staircase, living rooms, and dining areas. So areas that's currently receive natural sunlight will require internal lighting to be on throughout the day. And this as a consequence, Mr. Peroni informs me that one of his tenants has already advised that he'll be looking to relocate if this development goes ahead. Now, the R codes are quite clear. Overshadowing above 50% is permissible when solar access to adjoining properties and the living areas of adjoining properties is protected. And that's not my words, it's the plain wording of the objectives, to protect solar access. And I think it's abundantly clear when you review the plans and the city's own assessment that solar access to the outdoor living areas has not been protected and will be very significantly overshadowed during winter. Now, the underlying assumption behind this proposal and the city's assessment seems to be that everyone's entitled to build a big house regardless of the size, shape, and orientation of their lot. And regardless of whether this is a development that we'd like to see there, it doesn't change the fact that the only one who's being asked to compromise here is the residents of 107 Palmerston. And the history of this application suggests that it has perhaps been some expectation of compromise from the applicant based on the previous deferral and an expectation that impact on amenity will be reduced to acceptable levels. But to this point, and as the report states, the applicant is not willing to make any further changes. It should go without saying that you need to design your development to suit the property you have. And the applicant's desire to maximise development isn't our client's problem. All we ask council is that they either refuse this application on this grounds, or at the very least, to defer it again so that the applicant can achieve some meaningful compromise with the residents that would protect their solar access and amenity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Next speaker, please.
Hi. I'm Louise Schneider, 171 Harold Street, Mount Lawley. I'm speaking about petitions put in by a Harold Street Action Group, which I think is 6.1 on the agenda. Regarding the contents of the briefing agenda, we would like to ask the council to favourably consider and approve the suggested changes to resident parking. That is, implementation of resident parking on the south side of our street. Regarding the traffic management, we appreciate that Main Roads have already identified the intersections with Harold and Beaufort Streets as black spots, and funding is available this financial year to implement measures to mitigate adverse traffic events. But we remain concerned that even with the implementation of these measures, it will not address the traffic management concerns raised in our petition, with an anticipated increase in traffic volume associated with the imminent opening of the Chalice development, and the continued ability of traffic to use our portion of Harold Street as a rat run. We would appreciate council approve a traffic calming warrant check to assess if any other measures, such as our request of making our street one way, need to be implemented. It is our request that this warrant be instigated after the opening of the Chalice development. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Next speaker, please.
All right. Good evening, Mayor Cole and councillors. Peter Merger from Urbanista Town Planning, speaking to agenda item 5.1 for 109 Palmerston Street in Perth.
Sorry, Peter, just the suburb that you wish to state, or you can do Urbanista's address if you like.
231 Boer Street in Perth.
Thank you.
Just around the corner from the subject site. I was recently engaged by the owners of the property to assist with the development application process, and after reviewing the background information, I advised my client to lodge an appeal in the State Administrative Tribunal. My advice was based on the time and uncertainty of the assessment process that has taken us to this point in time. By way of background, the application process formally commenced in December 2021, when the application was first reviewed by the city's design review panel. Prior to this, the plans were discussed in meetings with officers at the city. 13 months after first presenting to the DRP, the application is being presented back to council for the second time, in between which it has taken a further 3 design reviews, 2 rounds of public advertising, and several rounds of revisions and requests for information. We're asked if further amendments would be presented to address the neighbours' concerns in January, but we're told that if those plans were presented, that we would require another round of public advertising and review, which would extend the time that a report could be presented to council till about May or June of this year. Given the uncertainty that we've experienced up until this point in time, my advice was to lodge an appeal in the SAT, which I think is understandable, given that the process started in 2021. By June of this year, it would have taken the city more than 450 days to determine an application that the planning and development regulations allocate a timeframe of 90 days. Furthermore, we would have knocked up sort of all of 450 days, being no sure of where the application would actually be supported. In that context, the recent announcements made by the state to increase the power of the JDAP at the expense of local government seem to make sense. Unfortunately, it highlights an ongoing problem when dealing with applications at the city, the assessment process being blown out time after time with applications that involve group dwellings. I think the councillors can see the problem, and I hope the management is able to find solutions. Otherwise, the number of applications returned by SAP and the JDAP will increase, and this is not something that the community wants to see. I don't wish to offend anyone, particularly yourself, Mayor Cole, but I feel that tonight my comments had to be direct and clear in relation to the planning process.
I do understand your point,
Peter.
Peter, but if you can keep to the specifics of this application, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm speaking to, I guess, why we lodged the deemed refusal. With respect to overshadowing, that is clearly a bit of a nonsense, given the fig tree overshadows the existing development and our own for more than I think the 60% that we propose as part of this application. We've shown that to the city. We can't move around that. The design is a good design. It is supported by the DRP. It has been articulated to allow sunlight.
So you've reached the end of your 3 minutes when you probably could have been speaking specifically, but anyway, you chose that path. So
No worries.
you might have to come back next week, or you could send us an email.
We will do. Thank you.
Okay,
Cheers.
thanks, Peter. Next speaker, please.
Good evening, Ashley LaFontaine, North Perth. I'm addressing item 8.4 and specifically the motion 4.12. At the AGM, I proposed on behalf of my community that ratepayers within the previous Highgate East State Underground Power Project area be refunded or credited towards their rates next year. This motion was carried, but administration's response here does not support it on the reasoning that all funds that remain in the underground power reserve at the completion of the project will be able to be used to support other projects at the city, subject to a decision from council. I'd like to ask, firstly, how much money is the city expecting to accrue in the underground power reserve at the completion of the project? And secondly, given the cost of living pressures ratepayers are currently under, lifting rates should have been a last resort. Why was this funding model selected instead of the previous loan model, which charged interest only to those who chose to defer payment to cover their underground power? Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Dudley Meyer Highgate. The first item is 8.4, the annual meeting of and the responses. So I'm disappointed but not surprised with the response about the suggestion about making it easier for residents to deal with e-waste. It's motion 416. It's unrealistic to suggest that people are going to drive all the way to Tamala Park or Balcatta or use the Verge valet service at $200 a pop to dispose of a computer screen, a laptop or some computer equipment. It's just unrealistic. And it's not about setting up your own recycling centre as suggested by the staff. It's about providing a big box somewhere that people can drop off stuff somewhere that's convenient, and just having a staff member with a ute take it somewhere to Osborne Park near the city's depot and deal with it. It's no big deal. The second item is the response to the suggestion about clarifying who can speak on behalf of the council. The response says that any non-DAP elected member can go to the DAP and speak as a council member representing the interests of the community, and I'm quoting them. And it's not about speaking, it's about purporting to speak on behalf of the city or council without the council first having taken a formal position. And as an example, the mayor recently spoke on the Bunnings proposal on behalf of the city without formally consulting the rest of council. She was against the proposal. So what happens if another councillor had gone along and said they were speaking on behalf of the council and they thought development was very good and it should be supported, particularly if the mayor hadn't been at that meeting? So, with regards to the commercial waste motion, there's a statement that the commercial rate in the dollar is 19% lower for commercial than residential. This either demonstrates a lack of understanding how rates work or is intended to incorrectly suggest that businesses have been treated favourably. The different rates in the dollar simply reflect the inconsistent changes to the relative GRVs about 3 years ago. It's like trying to imply that the rates in Claremont are cheaper than in Vincent because the rate in the dollar is 6.86 cents there, whereas Vincent's 25% higher at 8.5 cents in the dollar. The reality is that the average rate in Claremont is 2,370, Vincent is 1,720. So that argument is a furphy. The second item is 7.4, the mid-year review. So first of all, I note that the CEO's commitment at the budget with the 20.5 million capital works would be spent this year has been blown out of the water. Attachment, so what's the relevance to ratepayers. Attachment 5 shows that just under $1 million of ratepayers' money was not needed this year. There's also in the report acknowledgement about the $1 million mistake in the opening surplus, but there's no explanation, almost as if it's no real concern. So my questions are, how did the $1 million variance come about? And when were the staff first aware of it? And I'd be happy to get that in the briefing notes. There's also the fact that the $1 million surplus adjustment isn't transparently carried forward to the closing balance to reduce next year's rates. And I know all the counter arguments, but this is about transparency and not about resorting to sort of pea and thimble accounting that nobody can follow. There's also a recommendation to put $1.5 million in underground power reserve.
You have reached your 3 minutes, Dudley.
I'll finish the sentence then.
Thank you.
Thank you. Effectively obtaining a bridging finance for the project before you've even decided on a funding model. So it looks that it's far too early. The surplus should be carried forward until a decision has been made. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good evening. My name is Marco Vittino. I'm a resident and owner at Orange Avenue, Perth, and director of a small architectural practice at Munga Street, Perth. I refer to agenda item 8.6, information bulletin, attachment 7, register of applications referred to the Metro Inner North Joint Development Assessment Panel. Item number 5, which is 139 to 141 Lake Street, Perth. Both my residence and place of work are in close proximity of the proposed development site, and I'm here representing a group of over 100 concerned local residents and users of the adjacent Stewart Reserve who collectively do not support the current revised proposal for 139-141 Lake Street. We have submitted our detailed reasons for not supporting the scheme in writing, but in summary, believe it is excessive in bulk and scale and compromised in quality, amenity, safety, and sustainability. I wish to ask 2 questions. Firstly, does the city think it's appropriate to recommend the approval of a scheme which is not compliant with or respectful of the long-term vision of the area and will result in overdevelopment of a site beyond what the city's own policies deem to be allowable and acceptable in this location? And secondly, would elected members be willing to undertake a site visit to consider our collective concerns? Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Next speaker, please. Anyone further? Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for your comments this evening and your questions. For those that have asked questions, we can come to those when we ask questions of administration on these items. So tonight isn't the decision-making meeting. That will be next Tuesday, and this is a forum for council members to seek further information, ask questions, flag amendments, etc. So you're very welcome to stay. Just to note that we have received some public questions in writing. Chandra Woodley of Leederville in relation to item 5.3, James Penman of Mount Lawley in relation to 6.1. Mari, we had your statements in relation to item 8.4. Anthony Dowling of Leederville in relation to 5.3. And that was all. So thank you very much. We'll close public question time and we will go to declarations of interest. CEO.
Through Mayor Cole, received 1 declaration of interest from Councillor Loden in relation to item 5.6, which is the trees of significance inventory, 59 Ellesmere. The impartiality interest notes that Councillor Loden is a resident of the street and friends with adjoining neighbours. That's all for tonight.
Thank you very much, CEO. Councillors, any last minute declarations of interest? Thank you, Councillor Apollo.
I think I have a standing one. So it's the same as last week in terms of the potential for any development or maintenance related to the admin building and or the childcare centre at 244 Vincent Street.
We can include that in the agenda papers for the OCM next week.
Yes, I think if we've got a standing declaration that at least if it's either noted in the papers, it doesn't have to be read out each time, but probably pointed to.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Councillors, any other declarations of interest? Okay, in order to deal with the business that's been raised, first from members of the public gallery, I just wanted to check, because I know quite a few people have just left. Is anyone still here in relation to 8.4? Okay, well, what I might do then is I'll go to the other items that have been raised by members of the public gallery before that, because that item will probably be lengthy given that there are 20 motions from an electors meeting. So the second item that was raised was item 5.1, which is 109 Palmerston Street, Perth, proposed 4 group dwellings. So councillors, questions on this item, please. Councillor Loden.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to raise the question raised from the gallery around the overshadowing. I think the comment was that 3 of the properties is 70% overshadowing. One of them, of those 3, one was 90%. And how does that fit with the 50% overshadowing under the R codes?
Through you, Mayor Cole, if you can hear me.
Hello, Mr. Naidu, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Yes, Councillor Loden, how does that fit into 50% deemed to comply standard under the R codes? Under the R codes, 50% is a measure for the entirety of that adjoining lot at number 107 Palmerston Street. In terms of the comments made tonight, that was made in respect to each of those strata properties, individual units proportionally for those. So the R codes deemed to comply assessment for 50% considers the overall site area. The comments that you heard tonight are in respect to each of those units areas, but that is correct in terms of the extent of overshadowing for each of those units.
Councillor Loden.
And then just to follow up, I guess the entire site is 62% on the 21st of June. And that departs, I guess, for the benefit of those in the gallery. Why is that justified? The additional 12 point whatever percent overshadowing?
Through you, Mayor Cole, in terms of why it's justified, that justification needs to be grounded in the design principles. You heard that tonight from a presenter, and those design principles refer to consideration of extent of overshadowing of outdoor living areas and protecting north-facing major openings of the adjoining property. When you're seeking a design principles assessment, it's not about the extent that it departs from the deemed to comply standard. The R codes calls on an assessment in terms of its impact. And that impact, again, is around protecting outdoor living areas of the adjoining property as well as those major openings. In the officer's assessment, we've considered a number of things in respect to that. Though it is not from the proposed development itself, there is extensive overshadowing from the existing fig tree. Officers have included a diagram that demonstrates the extent of that overshadowing. It's greater than 60% of the adjoining property.
Manager, I just was looking for that because it is a very lengthy report, and I can't quite get my tabulations to come up in a readable format. Can you just point out that it might be useful for councillors just to have a look at that overshadowing diagram? I think it's attachment 13, but I can't have, if you've got a page number there, that would be very handy.
174.
Thank you very much, Councillor Castle. Sorry, go ahead, Manager.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying for that, Mayor Cole. Yes, that overshadowing diagram was drafted by the city's officers to demonstrate the extent of overshadowing from the fig tree to the subject site, as well as the adjoining property. And we've also overlaid the floor plan of the adjoining property. So it's demarcated in the green. So you can see that there is a substantial amount of overshadowing, but importantly, there would be additional overshadowing from the proposed development, particularly to the front portion of the adjoining property. And that's because of the angle of the sun and the orientation of the lot. So that is a relevant consideration. And though the total amount of overshadowing of the adjoining property standalone is reflected in the presentation made tonight, it doesn't account for the fact that some of that would be within the overshadowed area from the fig tree as well.
So councillors, that's quite a critical point. So page 174 is the overshadowing diagram, which shows the different layering. Any other questions, councillor Loden?
And so maybe just to repeat back what I'm hearing here. So the justification there is that there's existing overshadowing because of the fig tree, and that where that is separating from that, obviously we can look at the diagram, that is overwhelmingly not overshadowing open space. It's more falling on people's roofs and so forth, so that it's not causing an impact.
Through you, Mayor Cole. Largely, yes, that is part of administration's view, in that portion of the overshadowing would fall within the existing overshadowing from the fig tree. There's also the consideration of the existence of that fig tree on the other side of the subject property, which means that the development needs to be shifted or closer to that southern boundary and away from that fig tree because of the root protection area. And that came through as part of the assessment and the arborist report, which accompanied the proposal. So basically, the development needs to protect that significant tree, which is the fig tree in the Robertson Park. That also means that the development is to the southern boundary. And that would be consistent with the subdivision approval for the site, which has already been issued, okay, which shows the lots for development being towards this southern boundary. Finally, from administration's perspective, in terms of the assessment, still undertaking an assessment around access to sunlight throughout the course of the day. So the overshadowing diagram that you'd be referring to is that like a worst case scenario. So that's basically winter solstice, when day is shortest, but throughout the course of the year and throughout the course of the day, the sun would move, allowing access to some of those outdoor living areas in the morning for the front units 1 and 2 on the adjoining property, and units 3 and 4 in the afternoon as well. So that is also a relevant consideration in terms of access to sunlight.
Councillors. Manager, just a couple of questions from me, just in relation to the conditioned San Selmo reclaimed bricks, just seeking confirmation that that's the brick with the lighter appearance.
Yes, correct, Mayor Cole.
Thank you. And also just in relation to the increased primary street setback, but there still seems to be the hard stand. Was there any consideration of, with that increased setback, provision of additional landscape?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the setting back of the development 0.6 metres away from the street does provide additional landscaping area within that front setback area for Unit 1. And there have been, or there has been additional 2 trees planted within that area. But ultimately, by shifting the development back towards that northern side, that also increases the amount of hard stand, because effectively you're creating more driveway area or common property by shifting entire property back. So that's, I think, the compromise by trying to provide greater relief to the street and setting the development back. You're also going to have to extend the driveway area.
Thank you. And then I did notice on page 20, where there's a bit of the summary talks about some of the pluses and minuses of the changes that have been made. And it did talk about there being slightly more overshadowing to the rear of the neighbour's outdoor living area. Overall, I just wasn't entirely sure, because I think also the DRP was sort of raised this as well. Overall, do you have a view on whether the former plans were more beneficial or than these latter plans, or do you think that the benefits overall are better in relation to the revised with minor changes that we have before us?
Yes, Mayor Cole, that summary assessment was was provided to demonstrate that it depends on your test or your measure of appropriateness. So there were a number of concerns raised by council as part of its previous deferral. If one of those considerations was around overshadowing. Now, if that's your ultimate test, then based on the quantitative amount of overshadowing, it would reduce ever so slightly by effectively shifting the development towards the rear by 0.6 meters and shifting the development away from the side lot boundary by 0.2 meters. So that would effectively reduce the extent of overshadowing ever so minor. However, there is the concern around, I guess, where that overshadowing would fall, and you referred to that. By shifting the development back, it would ultimately impact the overshadowing to the rear unit more so because of the angle of the lot. So I think that's the consideration here. There's the quantitative amount of the overshadowing, but then it also comes down to what is that actual impact of that. I guess from administration's perspective, the impact to that outdoor living area to the rear would be greater. But again, that just needs to be balanced with the overshadowing amount in its entirety. So it's a challenging one. I'm not sure that if the changes are significant enough to say that one is better than the other, but there are improvements and some consequences.
Thank you, Manager. And just finally on the overshadowing, given that's quite the critical issue, the overshadowing diagram, which I've found on page 168, anyway, found it eventually. It does show the expanse of the fig tree overshadowing, but I'm just wondering, for the purposes of comparison between the fig tree and the built form overshadowing, is the tree overshadowing quite dense, or is that quite dappled, just in terms of trying to get an idea of whether it might be overshadowing but you're still getting some light penetration through, or is the canopy so dense that it's very similar to built form?
To you, Mayor Cole, I wouldn't be able to answer that with great confidence, so I can confirm that in the briefing notes.
Okay, thank you, Manager. Any other questions, councillors? Okay, thank you. We'll move on then to item 6.1. We still have Harold Street residents here, so we'll go to that item. Harold Street response to petition 6.1. Councillor Loden.
Thank you, Mayor. Just wanted to ask, in terms of our parking management strategy, how does resident parking fit in that hierarchy? My understanding is we typically start and then progressively work our way down in terms of the duration of restriction. So what is the basis for going from a 2P parking to resident only parking?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's a unique area with its unique challenges. What we are suggesting is mirroring the current restrictions on Mary Street, which currently have residential parking on one side and 2P parking on the other. So we're not really setting a precedent. It's just in this little catchment area. And I'm happy to share the survey results, which indicate there is a high usage rate where consideration should be given for residential only parking.
And maybe a difficult one. Do you know when we introduced the resident only parking on Mary Street?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I believe about 10 years ago, but I'm happy to include in the briefing notes.
And also, what was the last, another difficult one, when was the last time council introduced residential only parking elsewhere in the city?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I'd have to look through all council reports, but I'm happy to include that in the briefing notes as well.
And I guess the general thrust of my queries here is why resident only parking versus going to 1P or half P or pay parking with resident parking permits instead?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the Rangers have increased their patrols of the area significantly over the last couple of months. And what we found is it doesn't change users' behaviour in this area from 1P or 2P. So we're hoping that residential only parking has a greater impact, and rangers can enforce it more efficiently.
Councillor Loden, have you got anything else? Councillor Hallett?
Just two questions. Just following on from that, was there any consideration put towards introducing paid parking with a residential permit?
Through you, Mayor Cole, we tried that previously in Mary Street, and when what we found was it just moved the problem on unless you do the whole street, and council may consider that. But it was tried at the Beaufort Street end of Mary Street. We had a couple of ticket machines down there, and it just moved the problem further onto Mary Street. And I think that's one of the rationales why they introduced the residents only parking in the first place.
Thank you. And just the petitioner mentioned a request for a warrant check after the opening of the Chalice development. Is that something that administration would be willing to do?
Through the chair, yes, and engineering team can look at that after the development opens. Yep, that's not a problem.
Councillors, Councillor Konchevsky.
Thank you. Just in relation to the wording of the recommendation, been asked to note the current approved Main Roads WA funded black spot project. My understanding is that funding has been approved by Main Roads, but there hasn't been any consultation or approval of the design of the road treatment by council. Is that correct?
Through the chair, the application would have been made by administration back in 2019, and through that process there would have been a concept design. I'm just not aware what consultation was done back then, but consultation is planned to happen during the construction phase of the project.
Okay, so it hasn't. So the project is not currently approved, because it sort of says in the item 1 that to note the current approved Main Roads WA funded black spot project.
Through the chair, the project's approved to be delivered in the 22-23 financial year as a project.
But the purpose of consultation would be to assess the potential design and consider input, and therefore it might change. So it's an approved project, but the design is not approved. Is that correct?
Through the chair, generally with the safety projects, the consultation would be informed, and so the engineering team would typically letter drop and put information on the website that the project's taking place, as it is an approved project on the capital project for 22-23.
Okay, well, I'm happy to have a chat offline about that and the relationship to our engagement policy, and I'll speak to it if necessary at the meeting next week. I guess I just have a question in relation to the consultation on the proposed black spot treatment and the traffic calming warrant check, which is also noted to have some consultation on it. What's the timing difference in relation to those? How long does it take to do a traffic warrant check? And do we have an estimated timing for the completion of the Chalice apartments?
Through the chair, the traffic warrant check can be done relatively quickly, so in the next couple of weeks. From that, then a design would be, if it's warranted, a design would be completed. And then if there was funds remaining in this year's financial budget and time allowed the project to be completed, it would be something that could be delivered this financial year, but most likely would carry over to the new financial year.
Thank you. And just in relation to other black spot projects, there was some consultation being undertaken on a black spot treatment design proposed for the intersection of Harold and Lord Street. Can I get a status update on that? Will that be considered in, I guess, with all these proposed changes, or is that being progressed in isolation?
And through the chair, the Lord and Harold Street isn't funded by the Black Spot program this year, so it's from Muni funds, and that money is to investigate any potential treatments that we can do at that intersection this financial year.
So what were the results of the consultation that was already undertaken?
Through the chair, I believe there was some concept designs already consulted, and the engineering team's just gone through that consultation piece. However, the funds will be to analyze the treatments. As I said, there's no Black Spot funding for that project this year, so the Muni funds will be spent on the design to determine what treatment is suitable for that intersection moving forward.
Okay, nothing further.
Councillors, I did have a couple of questions. So in relation to the recommendation to council is that we consider the resident only parking on the north side of the street, but the residents have talked about the south side. Can I just get a bit of explanation of, I'm not sure if that's manager of ranger services or yourself, manager of engineering, but just seeking the rationale for north side of the street versus south side of the street.
Through you, Nicole, what we thought we'd do without setting a precedent, and then before the precinct parking management plans were reviewed, we would remain consistent in the area. So the opposite side of the school on Mary Street was residential and 2P on the school side. So we just wanted to mirror that to allow people during the day, parents, to attend various functions and they'd be less impacted. And also there's more residential housing on the other side of the street due to the length of the school.
So manager, does that mean that there'd be more bays that would be resident only on the north than if it was on the south?
I would have to take that on notice. I know there's 41 bays in the street, but I'm unsure of which side of the street.
Yeah, that would be useful, I think, to understand bay numbers on north versus south. That would be very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, just in relation to the recommendation, it does talk about the fact that we're going to consult on the parking, but it doesn't mention that under the consultation section in the report itself. I'm not sure whether that might have potentially been missed. Can take that on notice and have a look if you like. And in relation to the loading and taxi bays, I understand those changes would go ahead immediately if council adopts the as recommended.
Through you, Mayor Cole, that would be correct.
Okay, and just in relation to the Black Spot funding, probably similar to Councillor Gontaszewski, that it talks about inform. I had thought that when we last reviewed our community engagement framework that we'd actually talked about going further with our Black Spot, so that was no longer simply inform. So perhaps if you could just clarify that, that would be helpful. I'm happy for you to take that on notice. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Mayor Cole, I just have one more question.
Yes, go ahead.
This just relates to the loading zone. I guess, so if the intention is to implement the changes without consulting with the businesses, do we have a sense from the businesses around the timing of deliveries in relation to the clearway? Or sorry if I've missed that in the report, just that given that it is a clearway in the evening, are businesses aware, like will big businesses be given time to potentially change delivery schedules, etc.?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that would be correct. We give notice to the Beaufort and the other businesses potentially impacted. But just to reiterate, we're just mirroring the same restriction that's outside the Queens at the moment.
Different time of day though, I guess. That's probably because it's to do with the peak buses. Okay, any further questions on this one? Okay, thank you very much, managers. Appreciate that. We'll go now to item 8.4, responses to motions carried at the annual general meeting of electors held on the 2nd of February 2023. Just before taking questions, I just thought I'd say that because we do have 20 motions to deal with at the council meeting next week, I did discuss with the CEO in order to deal with that, if there are going to be amendments, it'd be really appreciated if they could be tabled by Thursday evening, Friday morning, so that way administration can work with councillors to get those ready and prepared, and it will allow us to be able to move forward through that item a lot more effectively and efficiently on the night. So if you do have items that you wish to move amendments, and you could send those in by email Thursday evening, Friday morning, that would be gratefully appreciated. Questions tonight, and if other questions come up during the week, again, please feel free to use the email so that we can again try to get as much questions out of the way before debating those items on next Tuesday evening. So questions, councillors? Oh, right. Yes, the CEO has just prompted me to ask if members of the public gallery are waiting on any specific items, because at some point we do have a confidential item to consider and we don't want to send you out until you're ready to go. 5.3, yes, that will be next. 5.2, nothing. Okay, 5.3 and 5.2. So after this item, we will go to 5.3 and 5.2. Thank you. Okay, questions, councillor. Councillor Hallett.
Through to CEO, through you, Mayor Cole. Motion 4.21, development green space. Just checking if it's correct that the recommendation is not supported, or is it actually at least partially supported, given the intent matches our practice?
Yeah, that's a good point through you, Mayor Cole. I'll have a look at that and we'll see if that wording reflects our intent. Our intent is obviously to support the intent of what was proposed there. I think the fact is we already have a policy in place that does that. So it's a matter of now reviewing it. So I think that there are parts of it that we support for sure.
Thank you. In the minutes, it refers to 4.9 being taken as a comment, while 4.10 would be considered a question and receive a response in writing. Can I seek clarification if that's an error, and 4.9 should also receive a response? That can be on notice. It's the one relation into the two that were merged about the voice. Has the city ever applied for heritage funding for Hyde Park?
Through Mayor Cole, we might take that on notice, because I'm assuming we would have worked with Heritage Council on the original, on the current, now slightly dated Conservation Heritage Management Plan.
Thank you. And this can also be on notice, but can admin comment on the whether or not the I guess the extent of using that conservation plan in relation to works? Yeah.
Through Mayor Cole, and I can just confirm that we do refer and we still use that heritage management plan. Obviously, it's a long-standing park. It's old, just because a document might have been prepared several years ago. There's still a lot of valuable information. So that is our guiding document now, and it would be until a new one replaced it.
Thank you. And does administration have a minimum amount of time that they would estimate before the Bunnings would be built and operational?
Through Mayor Cole, there's no building permit has been lodged. So at this point, it's very hard for us to give an estimate. I mean, if it was lodged, it would take over 12 months for it to be constructed. So at this point, we're talking about years before it would be built and operational.
Thank you.
Sorry, as an absolute minimum, if it happens at all.
That's all.
Councillors, questions? Councillor Gontaszewski.
I just have one on 5.1. So just in relation to the request for signage or renaming, And part of the justification around not supporting renaming is also pointed to the third-party advertising prohibition in the city. And I guess I just wanted to find out, as I'm not super familiar with the site, is there a external facing notice board or anything like that on site that might alert users of Braithwaite Park to the regular hires of the facility?
Through Mayor Cole, the lesser hall faces out onto the park. I think Councillor Loden knows it better than I do. There is a notice board in the main entrance as you walk in on the left where there are community notices. I don't think there's a notice board at the start of the lesser hall. So, but you often walk past the main entrance to the upper hall and past that notice board. We have no problems at all with.
Sorry, CEO. Councillors know that patch very well. You
Okay.
don't even go in the same entrance. Lesser Hall faces out to the park. So you're
Yes,
not
but
actually.
you do walk past on the left. I thought that the.
No, well, you're not
No.
normally, you'd park across the park. This is
You
what
park
the
on the other
locals
side
do.
and walk across.
They-
Okay.
The locals park or they walk and they just walk across the park. So you're not necessarily walking past a notice board. They're quite separate and distinct entrances.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Correct.
thank you, Sia, and thank you for that clarification, Mayor Colt. I guess if one was supportive of the perhaps intent behind the motion, which was to assist in alerting park users to the regular hirers of the hall, would the city see that as being of some benefit in terms of a notice board, which might be considered to be very different to third-party advertising or renaming an entire building?
Through Mayor Cole, we'll just check the frontage of the doors facing Braithwaite Park for the lesser hall to see whether or not that could be something we could put in there to flag who might be coming in at which times and essentially duplicate the notice board that's in the main one for that side. So it's a good suggestion. Just need to check there's enough space on the wall to hang the notice board, which Councillor Loden might know off the top of his head.
Possibly between the glass doors and the toilets. Yeah, but not on the glass because it's the refurb has glass, very open glass frontage, but there is wall between that and the toilets.
Just one for consideration, perhaps. And then just on e-waste, I know that the city has a number of recycling or drop-off stations that are in situ at places like supermarkets and Beatty Park. And I'm just wondering what those stations currently accept and what and perhaps why then an e-waste or a small e-waste collection point would be not appropriate in those to be included in those recycling stations.
Through you, Mayor Cole. At the moment, we've got 5 recycling stations. It's Mayor's, Woolworths and various shopping centres. They currently have batteries, fluorescent tubes and mobile phones, so it's quite small items. The problem with e-waste is that it does tend to be quite bulkier items. When we've had, there've been other councils, the bins tend to get broken into. There's a lot of antisocial behaviour, people trying to get things out of there, set on fire, and it's finding a suitable location as well. So I just don't, we did look at it, and the nearest, I accept that Tamala Park is quite a distance, but Balcatta is only 8.3 kilometres, so it's 15 minutes from here. That is an option. There's also options put in the notice of motion for take back at Office Works, so they will take all your bigger items as well. So I think there's fair few options out there already, in addition to the Verge side, Verge Valley. So I think there's a fair few options that people can access.
Can I just piggyback off that response, because there seems to be when Mr. Meyer was speaking tonight, he talked about $200 fee for Verge Valet, but my understanding is that e-waste is accepted items. So if you are calling up to do your free Verge Valet, you can have your bulky goods taken, and then you can also have your e-waste as part of that. So there's at least one free, is that correct? At least one free e-waste pickup from your Verge per year. Yes. Okay. Thank you for the clarification. Councillor Loden.
So then is the $100, I thought Mr. Meyer said 100, is that if you then had to do a second collection? Yeah.
Do you, Mayor Cole? Yes, that's correct. If you want to do a Verge Valley extra.
That was my first question. Sorry. There was a motion around the timing of Australia Day, and at the time they talked about the need for it to be before the 26th of January because of anxiety for people that are anxious to become citizens and so forth. In our response, we sort of referred to say that we can do it either 3 days before or 3 days after. Is there any reason why we couldn't say that we will always do it in the 3 days before Australia Day?
Through you, Mayor Cole. Yes, so we were this time round, we were considering that. First of all, it's not our only citizenship ceremony of the year. We hold them every few months, depending on numbers. So it's not the one and only chance of the year to do that. So I wasn't sure if the submitter was aware of that. In considering the timing of scheduling of this citizenship ceremony this year, I think there could be an argument for or against, particularly around the sensitivity of Australia Day for Aboriginal members of the community, whether or not the citizenship ceremony should be before or after. We decided that it should be on the Friday after. Our view is that I don't think you could argue that argument can be made both ways, as long as it wasn't on Australia Day.
Thank you. And then my other query was the decision making around the timing was down to administration interpreting a view expressed by council. What would prevent administration from doing it on the 26th of January next year? Or is it because it's not a policy position or a procedure or anything like that? Appreciate that this administration has taken on board the views of council, but if that changed, what would happen there in that context? Or do we have anywhere where that sort of is documented?
Through you, Mayor Cole, a civic ceremony is presided over by the mayor, so the timing of the citizenship ceremonies does require liaison with the mayor on the mayor's availability, and then also some logistical exercises around the venue and the numbers of people attending and what time of day and the like. And Mayor Cole's just pointed out, we also invite federal members of parliament and state members of parliament. I think it'd be inconceivable for anyone in administration not to understand council's view on that issue. So I couldn't imagine a scenario where anyone would be proposing Australia Day as the suitable time going forward.
Thank you. Changing tack to Menzies Street traffic. I was just curious to know if we have any, so the motion talked about vehicle movements, the amount of movements, and I was just wondering if we knew how many vehicles per day that street was experiencing, and if you had a general sense of the direction. Is it people traveling east or west where that's causing the challenge?
Through the chair, we do have some traffic data that we can review. I just don't have that in front of me at the moment. But yeah, we can definitely review the traffic data, and if warranted, put more traffic counters and analyze up-to-date data in that respect.
And I guess if we were interested in exploring the idea of creating a cul-de-sac, would its proximity to Ango Street as an activation opportunity be a good opportunity for the city to consider?
Through the chair, we need to do more traffic modelling if we are going to cul-de-sac and stop through flow traffic. And again, main roads would need to be consulted as they would ultimately approve any cul-de-sacs that we would construct.
I guess so. We looked at basically going the other side of Fitzgerald Street, where we're looking at the safe active street. We've kind of considered this number of around about above 1,000 vehicle movements a day. Is whilst these streets are rated for 3,000, if you're getting anywhere up towards 1,500 a day, that's getting to be quite a significant burden on that street, and would potentially suggest
intervention. Is this a question, Councillor Logan?
Yep. Yes, I'm getting to it.
Okay.
So if I'm trying to preempt a amendment to give administration time to consider. So if there was high vehicle flow, we were up around 1,500, what would be the appropriate amendment to put in there to get an intervention assessed there?
Through the chair, I suppose we would holistically need to look at traffic volumes, crash histories, and other big one, speeds. There's a whole suite of steps, and through the warrant check that we do, we can certainly look into that and see what that looks like. Probably don't have the words to an amendment right at this moment in time, but we can definitely look at something to put through. Yeah.
So I guess I would flag that if it is demonstrated as significant traffic volumes or like up around that 1,500, I would like to put forward an amendment around that to get some assessment of greater intervention there to reduce traffic volumes on that street. Then continuing on to Strathcona Street, the same question around volume as well there. Do we have any data at this point for Strathcona?
Yeah, through the chair, yes, we do have volumes for Strathcona, and off the top of my head, we're quite low. It has been created a safe active street over the last maybe 18 months or so, and that's reduced the speeds to 30. So just looking at the warrant for that area, I wouldn't believe it would meet the criteria to do any further traffic calming, as it is a safe active streets at the moment. Yeah.
And is it possible to get the vehicle movement data in the briefing notes as well?
Through the chair, yes, we can add them in.
And then similarly, if you were to turn this into cul-de-sac and create a public open space, would that help to address the deficit of public open space in that area as well?
Through the chair again, from an engineering perspective, we would need to step through the warrant scores and checks and balances, but yeah, I don't believe it warrants any further traffic control, but certainly public open space, yes, indeed it would add to that if it was to be constructed.
Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a question on motion 4.1 in relation to Lesser Hall. In the report, it mentions that the soon-to-be established outdoor stage in Braithwaite Park would expose the presence of the proposed RSL hall. The logo and the flagpole would complement the outdoor stage. Could we have some information about this proposed outdoor stage? I'm happy for that to be in the briefing notes for whoever has that info.
Through Mayor Cole, I understand that's an initiative from the town team, which they're pursuing.
Yes, that was my understanding as well, but I'd not heard that it had progressed at all beyond an idea.
Through Mayor Cole, that is not on the city's list of things to do at the moment, but we do understand it's been proposed by the local town team.
Thanks. Perhaps the that part of the report can be reviewed, because it certainly reads as if it's definitely happening.
Councillors, questions? Okay, I have a few questions. I was just wondering if we could potentially at the front of the report have a list of the motions, sort of like an index with the recommendation. That would be helpful in navigating it. In relation to motion 4.1, I wondered whether the city had considered talking about our principles of co-location and community hubs as part of the response to the motion. And also interested in Councillor Gondaszewski's idea of a community notice board stating the regular hirers. That would potentially help them with having the community use their services. In relation to motion 4.2, all the information is there. It's just quite dense. Sorry if that's don't mean that to be disrespectful. I just, from the perspective of a lay person reading this, it doesn't clearly sort of state that we have already got the 15% deep soil zone and the tree canopy. It's there if you look for it, but I just thought that could potentially be brought forward as part of the response. And again, that question of whether it's actually not supported or partially supported, I think that's a good question that has been asked. In relation to motion 4.4 on the Britannia Reserve pathway, I did just want to inquire as to whether administration has considered the fact that cyclists are currently using the footpath to access the freeway principal shared path, and whether consideration should be given to widening at least one part of that footpath. So because the motions about conflict between pedestrian and cyclists, is it something that the administration needs to consider to go to the heart of this issue of conflict between pedestrians and cyclists, potentially there? In relation to motion 4.7 and 4.15, the recommendation is not supported, but then the reason does talk about the fact that it's due to be considered by council at a pretty imminent council meeting. So just wondered whether council administration thought that just simply saying not supported doesn't go to that issue of the fact that it is due for consideration imminently by council.
Mayor Cole, agree. I think that probably relates to a couple of our responses. So it might be more accurate to say not supported at this time or not supported at this stage.
Yeah, I think that there shouldn't feel constraint to say supported or not supported. Or I think that where there's a ground
Pending future consideration of council or something.
I would appreciate that those sorts of things are incorporated into the recommendation. It's a bit more it's a bit blunt to say not supported when council's about to consider something very similar at an imminent council meeting. In relation to motion 4.8 and chemical sprays, council has sought quite a lot of information quite regularly on this, and I just wanted to follow up on the comment that complete elimination of the use of glyphosate ... is not supported due to the need to use chemicals for certain weed control requirements, e.g. eco-zoning program implementation and maintenance. Can I just get some clarification on maintenance, given that that is quite a broad concept, and that previously we have been informed that glyphosate use is continually being reduced. So if we could just have a bit more information about where glyphosate is being used for maintenance across the eco-zoning part.
Mayor Cole, we'll add that into the briefing notes. Understand maintenance refers specifically to the curbs and footpaths where this can be particularly difficult, and that's where we do apply glyphosate.
Could I ask just a question on that one?
Sure.
The lady that put that motion forward was talking particularly about boobook owls and the effect in using that poison for rats, and that those owls would pick it up.
That was rodenticides, which the city's recommendation is to support. That's a separate motion.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
Just an observation, though, that was being used at Britannia recently on the perimeter. So I'm still seeking guidance from administration on where it's used and where it isn't used. In relation to motion 4.12, Ms. Ashley LaFontaine asked 2 questions. Hopefully they've been captured. Just looking at other questions that were asked from public gallery this evening. I think that John Visca asked a couple of questions. Hopefully they've been captured in relation to the Hyde Park conservation. I think the rest were comments. In relation to motion 4.13, the creation of the cul-de-sac, could some further information please be incorporated talking to the DOT traffic study? And could consideration be given to if administration's rationale is that the projected traffic movements in the area do not warrant further investigation, would administration look at this in relation to the DOT study and or opening after the opening of the Bunnings once the impacts can be measured in real time?
To you, Mayor Cole, I can talk to 4.12 now if you like, in relation to the rates that were collected. If you'd like an answer now.
I'm happy for those ones to be taken on notice. Yep, thanks. And if we could just get clarity in relation to motion 4.16, that whilst it does seem to suggest that if it could just be absolutely crystal clear that Verge Valet, the free service once a year for residents, does include the ability to collect e-waste. And that was all from me. Thank you. Councillors, any further questions? Councillor Wallace.
Sorry, I sniped you there. I just had a really quick one on number 4.8, the chemical sprays. I was wondering if we've ever done any assessment of residual glyphosate concentrations in soils where we do apply it. I guess there's occupational health concerns around its application, but any, I guess, like ongoing risks to human or environmental health would be done on the basis of glyphosate stored in the soil. So I understand there's a question on notice about areas where we do apply it. I'd be very interested in knowing, or if we could, take a few samples, send them to one of the environmental labs like ALS or MPL, who would do that test pretty cheaply, and just determine whether it's being applied at the correct rate and whether there are any ongoing risks related to its use. Thanks.
I think that's a briefing notes response.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Councillor Hallett.
Sorry. Sorry, and just to go back to 4.3 citizenship ceremonies, I think if administration's response is supported and that's about enacting the motion, I feel like the response is a little bit, we kind of agree with it and the vibe is there, but that doesn't necessarily enact, that does not hold them in future. If it was to be in policy somewhere, where would it go?
Through Mayor Cole, if I could take that on notice just in terms of the guidelines we have around civic ceremonies and citizenship ceremonies, we could clarify that. We've got different things. I'll see where it's best placed and can include that in the briefing notes.
Councillors. Councillor Warner, Councillor Uplow, Councillor Alexander, do you have any questions on the electors' motions? Okay, thank you. All right, then we'll move on to item 5.3, which is number 209 Oxford Street, Leederville, proposed change of use from eating house to restaurant cafe and unlisted use shisha bar and associated alterations and additions. This is existing unauthorised development. Councillor Hallett.
Thank you. There was a bunch of questions from a neighbour which were in email. I just wanted to ask one of them, which was around if admin can explain how once identified the unauthorised development use is allowed to continue to operate.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, the city doesn't have the power to stop an owner from carrying out a development. We only have the power to commence a prosecution, and then the court would make a decision about what action they take, fines or any other enforcement that they can carry out. So as mentioned in the report, the city has commenced prosecution proceedings against the operator, and that's the extent of our powers. And the operator's decided to continue operating despite all of those things.
Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. I had a similar question and I just wondered if I could get some clarification on the compliance process because it has been quite drawn out. There was some discussion at the last council meeting about new processes that we have in place to flag these developments when they have been approved, but then later, to check on compliance. And I'm just wondering, do those processes, would they help in a situation like this where we've had an initial contact in July 2020 to say development approval was required, but then no further action by the city until November 2021?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. My understanding is that in relation specifically to this case, we found out about the unauthorised development, noting that they had an approval as a restaurant. We advised them that they needed to stop operating. And we didn't have any complainants at that stage. So I don't think we followed up to check. I think we left it at that. We told them they needed to operate as a restaurant only, and we took it on good faith that they were doing that and prioritised the matters that we had that had a complainant that was concerned about an amenity impact. So we prioritised based on impact, and that was the reason why we didn't follow up until we received a complaint. We followed up straight away because we had issued the direction earlier. We were in a good position to then carry out enforcement and the prosecution as well.
Okay, so then in May 2022, we received the development application. I'm just trying to understand what was happening between May and November when we commenced prosecution proceedings. Was that time used to assess the application?
A number of things were happening during that period through the mayor. The first thing was our approach historically has been to allow developments to operate if they have lodged a development application or have shown and demonstrated that they were working towards that. So they're putting their acoustic report together and all the other studies that they need to do. So when that occurs, historically, we've allowed that to happen. We've recently, that became an issue at one point when we had an operator that was clearly causing an issue, even though they'd lodged their development application. And as a result, we, at the time of working on the compliance and enforcement policy, council then endorsed a policy which said, in these circumstances where there's an amenity impact, we'll require developers to stop operating. And so that happened in the middle of this. And as a result, we instructed them to then stop operating. So there was a period there where we allowed them to keep going while their application was being put together and considered.
Okay, so apologies if I've missed it in the report. Are they currently operating the unauthorised use?
Yes.
And there was a request through their lawyer in November 2022 to withdraw the application, which there's no mechanism to do. Does that indicate that they're intending? I'm just trying to understand what you think the applicant's intentions are.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, their advice at that time was that from their lawyer was that I'm not sure if it was from their lawyer, but their advice anyway at that time was that they didn't need a development approval. They believed that restaurant covered the shisha component of their development. We disagree with that after taking legal advice, and so we consider that a development application is needed.
Thank you, Councillor Castle. I was also interested in the fact of the intentions, given that applicant's representative had sought to withdraw the application. They're still wishing for us to go ahead.
Well, my understanding is their request to withdraw still stands, but they've lodged the application. It can't be withdrawn, must be determined.
Okay. And they're still carrying out the unauthorised activity?
That's my understanding, yes. So the last inspection they were. Whether that's changed in the recent weeks, I'm not sure, but that's my understanding. Yep.
All right. Councillors, Councillor Hallett.
Sorry if I missed it. Is there a timeline for the prosecution to come to a resolution?
I guess I I can't just, provide any advice on what the court's going to do. I'd say that it would have, most of these cases go through the courts in 6 months or so. So it's likely that it'll be determined before the end of the year.
Director, there's a series of questions that were asked by a community member and received on notice, and they are very good questions. They sort of go to issues like, the unauthorised use and why is it continuing? Will council provide reasons if it is approved? Yes, reasons for decision will be provided. That it does hold a retail tobacco licence currently, and talks about the tobacco compliance branch, talks about the enclosed public place in the questions as well. They're all documented and have been submitted around to all council members, but thank you, Wendy. And it does talk about the 50% enclosure, talks about having a barrier fencing, does talk about additional car bays, given that there is 50 people proposed in a 3 by 3.5 metre space. Does that meet, apart from the public health issues of smoking, does that meet public health in terms of numbers and size of venue?
I might let the manager answer some of those questions, but I think the short answer to that question is yes.
Okay.
It does, because it's the entire establishment that's
Oh, sorry, it's
proposing
50
for that
overall,
number.
not just for this part of
Yep,
the use.
that's right.
Okay,
Yep.
that makes sense. Thank you. Manager, if you like, there's those questions from Mr. Anthony Dowling can be put in the briefing notes if you like, unless you wish to answer them now.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, happy to provide the responses in the briefing notes. Majority of those are covered off in the officer report, and we can pull those out. Happy to respond to any particular questions as well from councillors.
Okay, thank you.
After that. Thanks.
Any other questions on this application? No, thank you. Okay, one more item and then we will have to pause and consider our confidential, not consider, but have a briefing on the confidential item. So item 5.2, 103 to 105 Summer Street, Perth, and number 34 Cheriton Street, Perth. Proposed change of use to childcare premises, amendment to approve to incorporate a change of use from single house to childcare premises, including alterations and additions. That's quite a mouthful. Any questions on this item? No questions? I had one simple question. Do the two premises connect through the divide, through the what would be a boundary fence? Michael's saying yes. Thank you, Michael. They do connect. Okay. All right. That was really all from me. Youth plan. You sure? Okay. Any other questions on this item? One question. All right, thank you. The CEO has requested that we go to the youth plan item next, given that we have a staff member here on that. Karen, thank you, manager. Sorry, coordinator. Karen Baum, welcome to the meeting, and that is item 7.5, outcome of advertising youth action plan 23 to 26. Any questions? Well, at least you didn't have to wait until the until we dealt with the confidential item. That's all. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. All right. So we will now just need to go to confidential so that we can have a question and answer session in relation to item 11.1. I have to go to 8.6 because it was raised. The info bulletin. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for your patience while we had some questions and answers in relation to the confidential items on this evening's agenda. 11.1 and 11.2 have now been dealt with in terms of questions. So we will move to item 8.6, which was raised this evening by a member of the public gallery, and that is the information bulletin. Questions were specifically asked in relation to a matter before the JDAP, which was 135 to 139 Lake Street, Perth. So perhaps, Director, if we could go to that item first. There were some questions. Can you just advise the status of that application?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, the application's been was gone up for community consultation, and that's closed. The responsible authority report is due at the start of April. At this stage, so and we'd be more than happy to facilitate a meeting between council members that aren't on the JDAP, as well as administration and the residents, to have a discussion about the proposal and answer any questions and help them understand the process around the JDAP consideration of the proposal.
Thank you, Director. How many submissions were received?
I don't have that number off the top of my head.
Okay.
No.
All right. Sounds like there's a lot of interest. Okay. Any other questions in relation to the information bulletin? Okay, no questions. Okay, then we'll move to item 5.4 and continue to move through sequentially, because we have now dealt with all items raised by members of the public and confidential items, or items where staff were waiting patiently to go home. Unfortunately, you're stuck here, managers and directors. I don't know about you a bit though. You think your work is done here this evening. Item 5.4. Oh, Verge Valet. Well, perhaps we could go to that one. Okay, we will give consideration to the fact that our benchmarking does show considerable overtime. So we'll go to item 6.3, which is the waste strategy project, 2 bulk hard waste options appraisal update on Verge Valet Vincent trial, a proposal to extend for a further 6 months. Are the questions on this item? Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. Why do we need to extend the trial? Why can't we just go permanent?
We certainly could go straight to full time. However, the intention is to go out to public consultation to get feedback. The feedback from the users of the scheme has been excellent. And not an issue, but obviously that's only the participants. It's not the rest of the community. So that was my main reason for not proposing we go ahead with the scheme. Additionally, there are subcontractor is changing next year, so I wanted to ensure that there's a consistency in service and we're going to get the same high level of service going forward.
Okay, I'm just wondering if that couldn't be achieved with a different approach of consulting on a move to a permanent adoption of the service. Just from a process point of view, would that be more efficient to?
Yeah.
What's going to happen if we go to a trial? We'll then still have to come back with consultation. There's no consultation in the recommendation. I mean, given that the feedback so far has been very positive.
Yep.
It's just a question around whether we need to add these extra steps.
Can I just say though, if you're going to consult, you're going to have to report back in any case. So whether it's a trial and you do consultation, you report back, or whether you say go permanent and you do consultation, you report back.
So perhaps we could build some consultation into this recommendation so that at the end of 12 months, we only come back once more and say yes or no.
Yes. Sorry, through you, Chair. Yes.
That is a very good point, because I think it would be useful to have something noted in the recommendation around the consultation, if that's possible. Councillors, any questions on Verge Valet? Councillor Gonchevsky.
Thank you. I just having iPad difficulties, so if I've missed anything in the report about this. Just note that there were a few people that raised some concerns about Verge Valet, and in some ways it seemed to be that they were more suggesting some improvements. And I wondered around people that had talked about wanting to have a bit more space, whether there would be capacity within the system to, like say, if you hadn't had a Verge Valet in the previous year, whether you might get 5 square metres versus if every year you get 3. I'm just thinking you'd still potentially see a reduction in the overall allowance that someone might get. I was just wondering if there'd been any consideration to minor tweaks to what was being offered in response to any of the negative feedback. Well, not negative, the service improvement suggestions is what I'd probably term them.
Through you, Michael. I think personally, I think it's going against what we're trying to achieve with the waste strategy. We're looking to reduce waste that's been generated. All the other schemes that I've worked on in the past, we have a cut-off, you use your allocation in the year, you can't carry that forward. There may be someone that doesn't use it for 3 years, but then we don't want to have a massive bill and not be able to budget and account for that if everyone's using it in that year. So my preference would be to you have your allocation. If you don't use it, then you're doing the right thing. You're finding some other way of minimizing your waste and finding an alternate use for it, or the buy nothing pages or whatever. And we do push that really heavily at the front end too.
Councillors, Councillor Hallett.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. There was a comment in there that the projected cost is 42 grand over. And just wondering where admin's going to cover that from.
There will be, close to you, Chair, there will be some savings in landfill this year because of budgeting. That's not, obviously I couldn't foresee what was going to happen with the new trial. But there's certainly savings in landfill that will offset that.
Councillors, any further questions on the Verge Valet extension of trial? Okay, thank you very much, Manager.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me proceed.
Okay, we'll retry 5.4, advertising of amended policy number 7.7.1, non-residential development parking requirements and payment of cash in lieu of parking plan. Sorry, I added cash in there that actually wasn't in the title. Councillor Gonchevsky.
Thank you. So sorry, I'm not going to try and open it. I just wondered in relation to the hold on. In terms of the policy, there was some wording in relation to the objectives that sort of talks about to ensure suitable parking is provided for non-residential development which meets the needs of its users, is appropriate for its location and does not detrimentally impact the surrounding area. Just wondering whether it could be worth including reference to, I guess, in particular residential areas. This will relate to my next question. Just to ensure that the surrounding area, it makes it clear potentially that it is the commercial parking areas that are on street that would be preferred for parking, not parking on surrounding residential streets.
Through you, Mayor Cole, the objectives were reworded to have a more flexible approach so that the surrounding context would be considered. Just noting that that surrounding context really is around like the transportation, and that would be different in different residential areas. So that's why we weren't specific about those types of areas, so that we could do a case-by-case basis and really look at that surrounding context itself.
But if council wanted to make it clear to administration that the decision-making around the objectives of the policy would be to prioritise the maintenance of residential street parking over, then that would possibly be somewhere you could put some words in
Through
to
you,
make
Mayor
that clear.
Cole, yes, absolutely. We could change that so that the on-flow impact would be minimal.
And the other question I had was just around the parking management plan. I think when this has been discussed previously in a workshop environment, and I actually don't know if it was this specific policy or a discussion about developments, there was some questions asked around looking at how we consider non-residential parking, where a parking management plan or a parking study essentially puts forward on-street, non-paid bays in residential streets as being the reason why a business would not need to pay cash in lieu or not need to actually provide parking on site. And I felt, nope, not saying any statements, under the public parking facilities section of the non-residential parking local planning policy, the parking plan, it notes that the question is, are there any public parking facilities on street or car parks in the vicinity of the site? Just wondering if if it's intended that those public parking facilities would effectively include local streets as well as paid or streets within a commercial zone.
Through you, Mayor Cole, it would consider, I suppose, all of those things, the other methods of transportation. But if we're just looking at parking, it would be just noting that that would require the parking management plan, and that would need to outline all of those other methods of transportation. And then it would also have to outline, where that other existing parking options are in that area to show that the parking is not required on the site.
I'll just foreshadow, I'll possibly have some words that I will think of over the next week, just in relation to making it clear around where the burden of non-residential parking should fall if a development is seeking not to provide parking on the site or seek to have a parking payment cash in lieu plan rather than providing parking.
Okay, so we'll expect a form of words from you during the week. Okay, Councillor Gonciewski, thank you. Any other questions on the policy? Okay, thank you. We'll move to item 5.5, minor amendment to Metropolitan Region Scheme, Leaderville Parade Primary Regional Road Reserve. Any questions? Manager, I just had one question, and I think that there is provision. I just wanted to double check that if we do remove the road, this section, seek to have the removal of this section of road reserve, do we still have sufficient space within the road reservation that's there that would be remaining to create median and landscape down the middle of the street? Because I think that was the plan that was postponed.
I can answer that through you, Mayor Cole. The principal shared path project, which the state government is working on at the moment, does move closer to Leaderville Parade, the principal shared path, and has actually reduced the amount of space that was available for our project, which was putting the median in with the trees. So that the two projects kind of conflict with each other. So I think it probably would reduce the ability for us to deliver that project because of the principal shared path. We would have to eat into the car park land, expand the existing road reserve, the actual road area to make that work, which is not what we have been proposing to do. We propose to modify our project, potentially have the principal shared path move in the longer term, so that we can achieve all of those outcomes. But there's just not enough space for everything to fit in there.
Okay, so given that we have discussed that this could become the major connecting external route around Leaderville, given that we've also had an MRS amendment at the intersection where the Luna is, do you think that this in any way prevents that from happening?
Through Mayor Cole, we don't think it would, because there is enough space. It's just about the principal shared path having to move into the area where the trees currently are between the freeway and where Leadable Parade Road actually starts at the moment. So there's plenty of space. It's just there are huge trees there at the moment, and we're trying to avoid those for the time being.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, Councillor Iapolo?
Thanks, Mayor. Can you just give us an indication as to what the incremental value in terms of the value of the land that we may be seeking to sell here? What does this change? How does that change the value of the land to which may be sold?
Through Mayor Cole, we can take that on notice and have a look at the value of that land. We haven't got a valuation at the moment though that separates out that portion. The valuations that we have, I don't even think they considered that the principal shared path, that the primary regional road reservation was sat over that land. I think they assumed that it wasn't there. So we'd have to get another valuation, and we won't be able to do that before next week.
So I know that there was another valuation that was being done, it was discussed. So you're saying that the scope of this potential change wasn't considered for the purposes of getting the new valuation?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, this was all considered as part of request for new valuation, but we haven't received that valuation yet. So we're trying to leave that valuation until the closest date to council considering the request for proposal, so that we have an up-to-date valuation that's not, it's not old, basically.
Last question. So assuming council supports this, in relation to recommendation 2, what's the timing for the WAPC to actually consider that request?
Through you, Mayor Cole, they would have to conduct their own consultation on this. So it would depend on how much, similar to when we do consultation, how much consultation they get back and those types of comments. So we wouldn't be able to have a time frame on exactly how long that would take. These things really do range in how long they take. So I wouldn't want to say.
Through Mayor Cole, just to comment on that, the MRS amendment for the reduction of the road reserve on the corner of Oxford Street and Vincent was the fastest MRS amendment ever approved by the Planning Commission. That was done in about 3 or 4 months, I think. Usually the Planning Commission would quote up to 2 years for an MRS amendment, but given this is quite simple and straightforward, we'd be hoping it's much closer to the record time they took for the last time we made a similar request.
And sometimes minor amendments get wrapped up in omnibus MRS amendments, where there'll be a number of small fragments of land that are captured and put through to the WAPC as omnibus MRS amendments. So that can also be helpful. Any other questions on this item? Okay, thank you. Item 5.6, amendment to the trees of significance inventory to include the jacaranda tree at 59 Ellesmere Street, Mount Hawthorn. Any questions? Councillor Loden.
Concern was raised with me by a resident that around how you go about pruning the tree if the tree is going over their boundary fence. And so I was hoping just to get some guidance on, do they need to make a development application to prune a tree? And if not, what's their process?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, if this does go on the inventory, then there will have to be the approval for pruning. It's to ensure that it's undertaken in the correct manner, because as the arborist report demonstrates, this is a significant tree. So it does need that approval to ensure that that is conducted and this tree maintains its significance. Having said that, we do have a fund that can be given out to assist with the pruning of our significant trees. So it would be encouraging the property owner of this tree to utilise that so that the pruning can be done, cannot impact the other neighbours, and can be done to ensure that the significance of this tree is maintained.
And in the scenario where it's overhanging a boundary fence, who bears the cost of the application, arborist report and so forth for the pruning?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it has been the applicant of where the tree is situated that has paid for the arborist report, and the pruning would be their responsibility to then apply for that funding.
And if the neighbour believes it needs to be pruned, but the owner does not, what do you do in that situation?
Through you, Mayor Cole, they could still request the funding for the pruning, but they would just have to ensure that it is done in the same way as the arborist report that is the owner owns that report. But as long as the pruning is done in line with that, they can request the funds to enact that earlier if they feel like it needs to be done earlier.
And if is there a gap in cost between what it costs to prune the tree versus what the funds are that are provided?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's a case-by-case situation.
Councillors, Councillor Oplow.
Just for my understanding, so when someone does do this application like this person has done, does that mean they can never remove the tree? Is it something like a equivalent to a heritage thing that they can never touch it, or do they need approval from City of Vincent to do anything with it?
Through you, Mayor Cole, they require approval. So it can be removed, and there are, within the policy reasons why it would be removed. For instance, if it no longer is significant due to the arborist report, but they would need that approval to prove that.
And does that obligation continue to if that property was sold? That same condition applies to the new owners?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct.
Councillors, any further questions? No, okay. Item 5.7, Community Sporting and Recreation Facilities Fund and Club Nights Lights Program, February Small Grants Round application, seeking Council's approval to apply for 3 grants. Any questions? Okay. And just noting that Councillor Warner has left the meeting this evening, so it's great to have her here in attendance online. Item 6.2, RFT IE 190 of 2022, North Perth Town Hall Toilet and Kitchen Renewal. Any questions? Manager of Assets has popped up, but looks like we don't have any questions for you. Councillor Loden's not in the room. Councillor Loden, we're asking about a tender. Did you have any questions in relation to the North Perth Town Hall Toilet and Kitchen Renewal tender? Yes.
Only one tender response? We couldn't get any more than one?
Yes, we actually had 13 contractors show up to the mandatory site briefing, but only one chose to submit a tender.
So I thought through our contracting process, we were supposed to get at least 3 tenderers. I guess, is this part of a challenge of COVID and so forth, or is there an alternative? I guess probably don't want to go out to the market again, given that happened, but.
Yeah, I think the process was fair and equitable. So the respondents obviously chose, well, the people that came to the mandatory site briefing may have chose not to submit a tender based on timelines or their own capacity of works.
And my understanding is this has come within the expected budget, because we're not asking for additional funds, so it's not like we're getting gouged.
No, so it's actually come in under the North to Perth Town Hall and the Lesser Hall combined budgets are at 296, and the tender submission is coming in at 247.
Councillors, Councillor Oplow.
Just to add on to a question that was asked just now, I did recently review. Sorry, I thought it was compulsory that you needed at that level of spend, you needed 3 quotes if it wasn't from an approved tenderer, or 2 if it was a pre-approved tenderer. So I'm just trying to understand how that actually works. I wasn't clear from the responses from that last question.
Just to clarify, so I went to open tender. So we weren't seeking quotes. We went to an open tender. So we didn't ask 3 providers for 3 quotes under a threshold. We were going to an open tender, which means anyone could respond. And if we receive 1 response, then we assess that against the criteria.
I'll probably come back with more questions next week.
Yeah, just to add and clarify that there was a mandatory site briefing as part of the tender tender package. We had 13 contractors show up and only one out of those chose to submit. We are chasing up with some of the contractors as to understand why they were not willing to submit a tender, and hopefully we'll have that information for you at council.
Councillors, Manager, just in relation to the scoring at 68%, and ordinarily would see things in sort of 70s, 80s. So you're still satisfied that this this will be a job well done?
Yes, we have followed up with recent references and they are more than capable of doing the work and meeting the specification that was put out.
Okay, thank you. Any final questions on the tender? Thank you very much, Manager. We're moving on from infrastructure and environment to community and business services. Item 7.1, financial statements as at the 31st of January 2023. Any questions? Okay, 7.2, authorisation of expenditure for the period 1st of January to 31st of January 2023. 7.3, investment report as at 31st of January 2023. Any questions? Item 7.4, mid-year budget review 2022-23. There was a briefing on this at the workshop, but are there any additional questions? Councillor Opolo.
Thanks, Mayor. I just want to clarify when it refers to mid-year budget review, are we literally saying that it's as at 31 December?
Through you, Mayor Cole, this is based on 31 January data.
Is there any evidence between now and 31 January that there's been any other projects that may be subject to slippage?
Through you, Mayor Cole, this is based on our assessment at the time. Obviously, the mid-year budget process takes a number of weeks to complete. So as at that point in time, this is our best case estimate. There potentially could be other items in the last couple of weeks, which we haven't factored in as part of this review.
So as at 31 January, as far as we're aware, so 7 months into the year, what administration, just to confirm what administration is saying, is that effectively 3.5 million of the original $20 million capex won't be spent in FY23 as previously forecast.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, that's correct. We've essentially for those projects, for various reasons, they will not physically be spent in this financial year. It could be procurement or other reasons, but anticipating the funds will be spent in FY24 instead.
Okay, that was another question. So it's definitely timing and it's not a permanent difference. You're just saying it's slippage into the next financial year.
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct. So one of the projects is the leadable oval lights. Obviously, there's still probably a number of things to go on there, but we're forecasting that will be spent in FY24 as well at this stage. But all the other ones, there's some light sort of fleet vehicles as well, which with the long lead times, they should be procured in FY24 as well.
And just specifically as to the reasons why we weren't able to forecast these particular slippages, have you got a generic answer as to what has happened as to why we didn't predict that they would flow into the following year?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole. So the challenge we have in local government is we can't actually commence a project without budget there. So we physically wouldn't be able to order the vehicles unless we had an approved budget. So from time to time, there could be slippages in the following year, but with the procurement timelines to physically be able to order something, we need budget. So it is one of the sort of restrictions in local government.
I didn't understand that. I'll just rephrase the question. It was, what's the high level reason why the capital work slipped and that we couldn't forecast it?
Through you, Mayor Cole, so at the time of preparing this budget, administration were of the view that all these projects could be delivered within the year. As we go through the year and we go through procurement and very other priorities sometimes take precedence, we reassess and we adjust our budget accordingly during the year. So the mid-year budget review is a chance for us to sort of pivot and reassess where the priorities are and what a realistic estimation is to complete the year out.
Okay, so you're saying forecasting risk and that there was some reprioritisation.
Through you, Mayor Cole. Yes, that's correct.
What proportion of the 3.5 million over budget of capital spend was funded through municipal funds, like funded by ratepayers in the last rates as at 1 July?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole. So in attachment 5, we provide that information. So essentially the amount there for 950,000 transferred to reserves. Those are funds we've collected through municipal funds, and we're going to put them aside and spend them in the following financial year. The other sort of 4 columns there are essentially funds that were either coming out of reserves or grants and contributions or proceeds from disposals we haven't received yet, but we forecast to receive them in the following year.
Okay, so 950,000 was funded through municipal funds out of the 3.5. Thanks for clarifying. Is that roughly about, if I get my math right, can you just confirm that that relates to roughly, it's 350,000 is 1% rate increase, isn't it? So it's roughly 3% of the rate increase of the 7.6 that we charge. It's roughly 3% of that rate increase.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yeah, approximately. On the current rate base, it'll be about 2.5%, but as at the time of preparing the budget, it would have been closer to 3.
Given that these delay to capital expenditure is pushing into FY24 and we still need to do it, what's the logic of administration wanting to redirect these funds for different purposes, specifically 1.5 million into underground power and 1.25 for Tamala Park reserves?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole. So the 1.25 Tamala Park reserve, that's essentially putting it back into reserve. So at the first quarter budget review, we pulled them out of reserve to put them in our municipal funds. In case City of Perth did sell their share, we had to buy back into it. So this is just reversing what we had in the original budget. So there's actually no net change there within the year. Underground power is our priority for the city over the next sort of 5 to 10 years. So we're doing everything we can to be able to put ourselves in a position to provide ratepayers longer payback periods. There was a number of sort of operational savings and additional revenue through the mid-year budget review, and we decided to start to build that underground power reserve to be able to actually borrow enough to provide ratepayers with longer payback periods.
I understand. So the 1.25 for Tamala Park, you're saying that's just a reversal of a reserve, doesn't form part of the 3.5 million reduction. That's correct?
Yes,
okay.
It was sitting in muni funds
Thank
in
you.
the first quarter review.
Okay, great. So, but in relation to the other amounts that's moving to reserves, like for the underground power, if you're saying that this spend on deferred capital works will need to be done in FY24, you're effectively, like, I don't understand why you're pushing it to underground power when you're saying that the work has to be done anyway.
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole, we've essentially put enough into reserve for those projects we've deferred. So this is over and above that. So essentially, we had an opening surplus. We've got some additional interest revenue on our sort of investments. There's some additional parking revenue as well. So those additional revenues, we've decided to put those into reserve over and above the budget. So this is nothing that was budgeted originally. This is a favorable position halfway through the year that we identified, and we've redirected those funds into reserve for the use of underground power in the future.
I'm not following, sorry. So the 3.5 million over budget, we're saying we're going to do those works in 2024. And so my question is, where is the 1.5 million coming from underground power? Are you saying it's coming from additional revenue and not from the capital works?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct. Yes, if you have a look at attachment 5, the 3.1 million in carry forward assets, we've sort of accounted for where that's coming from and going to. So 950, we've put aside for that to be spent next year. The underground power reserve money is purely just predominantly from a favorable operating result for FY23. $750,000 relates to interest revenue due to higher interest rates. There's some additional parking revenue as well. And we obviously had an opening surplus as well at the beginning of the year over and above what we budgeted to start the year at. And that related to probably, without checking off the top of my head, operational savings from FY22 as well.
The 3 million on attachment 5, 3.1 million, which would have otherwise been carry forward capital works into the opening balance. It does say that has all been accounted for here, but I might just come back with a question during the week or next week if that's okay. Yep.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, happy to take questions later on.
If Oh, sorry, one or two. If in relation to the underground power, and I think Dudley asked a question in question time. If we haven't worked out what the funding model is for underground power, and the funding model being what is the way in which we can help certain ratepayers pay back effectively pay back the charges for underground power down the line, 3 or 4 years down the track. Do you think why is it appropriate that we allocate 1.5 million now into this reserve before we've actually done the work on the funding model?
Through you, Michael, we have done a lot of work on the funding model as presented to council at the budget workshop last month. What we do know is we can't physically borrow 100% of the projects. So to be able to provide longer payback periods, we do need some money in reserves, and that's just the reality. So we'd love to be able to borrow 100%, but the speed at which we're having to roll underground power at the city, given the age of the infrastructure, all coming up for renewal at a similar time, means the city's ability to borrow is constrained. So we will need additional reserves. We are modelling what those reserves are and what those payback periods are, but we are fairly well progressed with that modelling at this stage.
But council at that workshop didn't council at that workshop say that some of the assumptions of the modelling that was presented could be challenged, i.e. 70% of ratepayers may want to access this funding model, and also ideas as to where the third parties could fund the loan. So my understanding was that the modelling was still to come back to council. It was still a work in progress, and because it was a work in progress, I'm wondering whether it's appropriate that at this point in time we allocate 1.5 into a reserve when, again, I'm wondering whether, in your view, do you think that's not premature?
Through you, Michael, no, we don't. Essentially, the 5 scenarios we presented previously, the scenarios that council were in favour of, we couldn't fund based on that scenario modelling. So with the 1.5, it does make it easier for us to make the scenarios work, and we'll have some more information in a couple of weeks. But in short answer, we will need additional reserves to be able to make a faster rollout of underground power work.
And lastly, this is all about over budgeting CapEx. But why not leave this the amount that we received from municipal funds from ratepayers because of an over budget? Why not leave it in the opening carry forward for capital works, so that the effect of doing that, as opposed to what you're doing here, as I could see, is that the ratepayers would pay less next year for when we come to do our budget? Because if it's remained in the opening capital works carry forward, then it would be to the benefit of ratepayers. They would be paying less for rates next year. But by moving it in the way that you're doing it here, you're effectively banking that money, and it doesn't carry forward in the opening carry forward capital works balance.
Through you, Michael, just to clarify, are you referring to the 950 the transfer to reserve in the muni funds, or are we talking about the 1.5 million underground power amount? Which one are we discussing?
I care about the $1 million that was raised from municipal funds. So I'm presuming that is that not going into the underground power?
No, through you, Michael, that's going into the asset sustainability reserve.
Yep.
And that will be accessed next year. So ratepayers won't get rated again for that. We're essentially quarantining that money, and we're saying we will spend it next year. We've collected it this year, and we'll commit to those projects, and we'll deliver them the following year. So no, we will not be rating again. If it's sat in surplus, it's exactly the same result, because then we'll just take out a surplus in the following budget year. But we're actually restricting the use of those funds to reserves to only be spent on those projects in FY24.
But correct me if I'm wrong, the difference though is if it's in the carry forward opening balance, it 100% will reduce the amount that ratepayers have to pay. If it goes to reserves, be it an asset sustainability reserve, then that's it to administration's discretion as to whether it's spent and used and drawn out of reserves to any capital works that are budgeted for FY24. So it's not a guarantee.
Through you, Michael, the only way it would benefit ratepayers is if council decided not to proceed with these projects. So that's the only way the funds would then be able to be used for something else to ultimately reduce the sort of rate increase. In this instance, if we are going to proceed with these projects, we are essentially putting that money aside, It's notionally like it's sitting as surplus, but all it does, it restricts those funds so we can only use them for these particular projects and nothing else.
That last question. If there is amount sitting in any type of reserve and there is something in a capital works budget, so for FY24 that relates to that item, is it 100% required of administration to finance that asset capital works from reserves first, as opposed to municipal funds in the following year?
Through you, Mayor Cole, if reserve funds have been allocated to a project, they will be spent on that project. A lot of the time it's a combination of both, but if we put aside $500,000 for a particular project in reserve, we will spend that for that project. If there is a change to that, we'll come back to council through a budget review and seek approval for an adjustment. But as it stands now, these funds have been quarantined for these projects to be delivered next financial year.
Can I just clarify, Mayor Cole? I think it's just important to note that money can't be spent out of the reserve by administration unless council adopts a budget that states that that amount of money needs to come out of reserve for that project. So administration can't access reserves unless council has adopted use of those reserve funds for a specific project. So council is the one that makes the decision about use of all reserve funds.
So it's not guaranteed. It's subject to council approval. Thank you.
We've given an undertaking. I think that's the point. The undertaking is made that you have a mid-year review, you say, on the basis of administration saying that this, for whatever reason, won't be spent. It could potentially be procured. That process can start because funding is there. But the pact that you have is that when you're doing these, making these decisions about funds being transferred to the Asset Sustainability Reserve, that funding will come out next year for that project.
My point being that you can change that. You can move it from one, like we have here. We allocated costs for a particular reason and we're moving
No, I
it to
get that, but I think
purpose.
that goes to intent, and I don't think that reflects the intent of this council. So I just wanted to clarify that.
The intent not to change but we're doing it here. That's what
I feel that the questions have been answered very well by our CFO, and it's about a timing and a preservation of those funds in the Asset Sustainability Reserve for that purpose. Councillor Loden.
I just had a query around the Beatty Park change rooms. So we've gone from a budget this year of 850 to, if I'm reading correctly, the budget will be that come back in our next budget is $1.2 million for that. Have I got that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole. So I think what has been disclosed here, essentially the current estimates are 915,000. We have 650 in the current budget, which we're putting to next year. In the current version of the 4-year capital works plan, there are sort of two items for the change rooms. Because it's such a large amount, it was spread over the 2 years, two sort of separate periods in the 4-year plan. I think the initial estimates were it was going to be 1.2, so which is why we have provision for that amount of funds. At this stage, it's looking more like 900,000. So what's written here is essentially saying the project will take probably more than a year and be spread over 2 financial years in the 4-year plan.
So maybe to put it another way, we put 850 in this year. And if we approved budgets more than 1 year, if hypothetically we'd put a plan in for next year, we would, complete that project, we'd put effectively $350,000 in that. We're pulling some of the money out of, we're pulling a bunch of the money out of that and putting it all, and we're going to deliver it all next year, effectively. But we need to top it up a little bit because of the funds that we're using for the tiling that we're bringing forward.
Yeah, through you, Michael, that's correct. Just say the current timing is it'll be delivered across FY24 and 25. So 650 is being put in reserve for that into 24, and we would seek some additional funds through the 4-year plan to be able to fund the remaining portion in FY25. But yes, that's correct.
And just from a process point of view, I know we've got in it, I think it's attachment 7, the change request is attached to this report. So is that effectively council's approval of the change of that project?
Through your Mayor Cole, yes, that's correct. So that's come up with the mid-year budget review as well, because there has been a delay to that project and there is a change in budget. So essentially, council is approving that, but it is obviously still subject to us having the funds within the development of the FY24 budget as well.
So we'll effectively reconsider it next year anyway, when we get to that budgeting process. Thank you.
Councillors, any further questions on mid-year review? Thank you very much, CFO. Okay, that takes us to Chief Executive Officer items. So 8.1, City of Vincent ordinary election of the 21st of October 2023, appointment of electoral commissioner to conduct the election by postal vote. Any questions? 8.2, advertising of amended policy, legal representation for council members and employees. Councillor Iapolo.
Yeah, just in relation to the change made in the preamble to the policy, it's indicated that the Local Government Act protects both employees and councillors. I'm coming with a question for anything that's done in good faith. As long as they've acted in good faith, the Local Government Act protects it. Why do we need this policy as a result of that?
Through Mayor Cole. So the department has given some advice about enshrining that provision and ensuring that you have clear protections available to staff and elected members about what our obligations are as a duty of care. So while the Act does provide an overarching statement, it's necessary to have some clear guidance about what our position is and how someone would be able to access those protections in the instance that they were facing a legal claim.
So I guess my question is, if the Local Government Act provides a protection under 9.56, and this policy is giving now, through the changes, the CEO's ability to approve for legal representation costs, particularly for employees, I think council will still need to approve council legal fees. How do they work? Like if there's a decision from a City of Vincent's point of view that the legal fees won't be covered, but the Act under 9.56 allows for that protection where it's in good faith. So the only difference I can see, and I want you to confirm this, please, is that this policy allows the City of Vincent to pay for legal representation costs for either employees or councillors when they're acting not in good faith.
Through the chair. So basically the Act provides a head of power for setting out that staff and elected members are protected from wrongs, from being prosecuted for wrongs where they've acted in good faith. That's just sort of a blanket statement. This then provides a pathway for how we would consider, or what measures we would consider if someone was faced with an instance where they're accused of being in the wrong. So I guess that's two parts. Then in terms of the responsibilities of the council or the CEO is to undertake that assessment of whether or not someone is being wrongfully prosecuted for something that they did in the line of their work that was in good faith. Then the CEO can provide that we would cover the legal expenses. But in the instance where the CEO resolves not to support that, it would typically be where they've not acted in good faith.
But how can the CEO be in a position to make that adjudication when it's subject to a proceeding in court? So the court will ultimately decide whether, in fact, someone actually acted in good faith or not. How is it that this policy requires the CEO to make a decision ahead of time? How can he or she make that determination when it is ultimately subject to the court?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Happy to take it on notice if you like.
Through Mayor Cole, in the scenario describing, if I or another manager thought an employee wasn't acting in good faith, they nearly certainly would have breached the code of conduct. So they'd already been investigated for breaching the city's code of conduct, and the same would apply for a council member. If a council member wasn't acting in good faith, they're likely to be subject to a complaint under the code of conduct, which is a separate issue to this legal proceedings policy.
And through Mayor Cole, if I just might add, I think there's two separate things here. So the Act, provides a very clear protection for council members. It doesn't give council members a right to have legal fees or advice. It just provides a protection. So it doesn't mean that local governments would pay an individual council member's legal fees. The policy is what creates that and enables that. So there's no obligation for local governments to pay the legal fees unless the council's decided that they have a policy or an approach to do that. So all the Local Government Act does is provide a protection. So that when you end up in court paying your legal fees, whether they're being paid for by the local government or by yourself, you can use that as a defence.
So what is the local? What does 9.56 protect then? If it's not legal fees, then what are you saying? If there's a case for damages,
correct?
But that's only if you're guilty,
correct?
But then if you're guilty of, you would be not acting in good faith. So I'm confused because this is saying that 9.56 only covers you when you're acting in good faith.
Correct, that's right. So the legal fees would only be paid for by the city where you've been acting in good faith. And then you can, use those legal fees to pay for a legal defence on the basis that you've been acting in good faith and therefore you're protected by the Act.
Can I just get some notes in the briefing notes rather than continue to ask questions that specifically addresses how is it that this policy, which is at some discretion of either council or the CEO, how can this policy potentially deny a request for legal fees when the local act specifically says that there is some protections when someone's acting in good faith?
Through Mayor Cole, just to clarify, we wouldn't deny an employee legal representation if they're acting in good faith in the course of their duties.
The court's going to decide that. That's my point. I mean, I don't know how. Are you saying that this policy would work with a condition to say if the court upheld our view that the person was acting in good faith, that then therefore only on that basis will we reimburse any legal fees?
Through Mayor Cole, just to clarify that if we thought an employer wasn't acting in good faith, they probably would have already gone through a code of conduct process and they may no longer be an employee of the City of Vincent.
Does this policy actually require a referral to a code of conduct? Because you're assuming that someone actually going to make to raise an issue to the City of Vincent over a course of because of the code of conduct. They wouldn't have to do that. They could just decide to take legal action.
Through you, Mayor Cole, no, the code of conduct's an internal document. So that was if we conducted an investigation, an employer had breached the code of conduct because they weren't conducting their duties in accordance with that code of conduct and they weren't acting in good faith, depending on the severity of the breach of the code of conduct, they may or may not still be an employee of the City of Vincent. If they were no longer an employee and they were found to have breached the code of conduct, they might be subject to legal proceedings if they'd committed something within a third party. That would no longer be may no longer be an issue for us.
Okay, if you could add to the briefing notes the clarification that in the event that the city determines by review of the code of conduct that there's nothing that the person has acted in good faith, that if there is a court case that happens and proceedings are taken against either an employer or a councillor, and it's proven that they acted in good faith or that one of those people acted in bad faith and you didn't adjudicate that this policy in retrospect would still cover the person.
Through you, Mayor Cole, if the city was going to essentially fund legal proceedings, we'd be doing so on the basis that we thought we had an argument and a case.
But my question, David, is if you get that wrong and the court takes a different view.
Can I just say, I feel we're going around in circles here. But
someone's answering the question.
Councillor Uplow has requested for this to be dealt with in the briefing notes. Does administration feel they have sufficient information about the question to be able to provide the response?
Yes, I'm clear on what you're asking and we'll seek to provide that.
Okay. Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. I really was just going to add that perhaps those notes could clarify the distinction between there's two different legal tests here. There's the test that the city will undertake as to what is in good faith. The CEO's just said that's in the performance of their duties as defined by the city. There's probably some case law on the legislation, but that may well be a completely different legal test to what the court case relates to, might have absolutely nothing to do with the two. And I don't think that we should get too confused between the two different tests.
Councillor Gonchevsky.
Thank you. My question just relates to the removal of the section around repayment of legal fees that have been funded by the city, as to what the intention was behind removing that section.
Through the chair. So what's intended is that we've removed those clauses 3.5, 3.6 and 7 that require repayment of legal costs, and these are going to be assessed and determined on a case-by-case basis. And so we've amended 5.1 and 5.2 to include that it can be granted, it can be refused, or it can be granted with conditions, and a condition could require the repayment of legal fees.
Okay, but if it was council's intent that that the legal fees should be repaid where like in particular circumstances, then that would require an amendment. So that it was to make that clear within the policy.
Through the chair, I believe that, say for instance, you wanted to say the fees, legal fees would be refunded subject to the matter being dismissed or something like that, then you could have those limitations already in the approval conditions.
But the approval conditions aren't approved by council, are they? We just approve a policy that provides direction to administration on what they might include in conditions.
Yes, but the intention of the policy review is to remove council's input into the staff member decision-making element. Council would still have control over any requests made by elected members. So the responsibility for determining the conditions and those would fall to the CEO for all staff members. And if it came down to a matter of budget and things like that, then separate arrangements could be made to present that. But what we're trying to really differentiate here is that the staff are the responsibility of the CEO, and he would be responsible for imposing any conditions and making decisions around that. And any matters related to elected members or the CEO would come to the council.
Okay, but clause 7 relates to council members and staff. So, and I guess that was my other question in relation to this. So I'm assuming that on implementing this policy, then in effect, council is giving the CEO authority to waive legal fees up to the value of his financial delegated authority in terms of that 250 threshold, subject to budget within that particular line item. Kind of just, that is correct, yes?
Yes.
And if the so I guess on that, if I could just, sorry, just confirmation of the extent to which, you know, council has approved waiving of legal fees in recent times, and I guess an indication of how far 250k might get us, or what our current budget is for legal fees, etc. Yeah, I don't have an issue with the CEO taking responsibility for that side of operations. I think I'm unsure that that 7 is reasonably and fully covered by 5.1 and 5.2, but I'll have a think about that during the week. But thank you very much for that information.
Through Mayor Cole, I think this issue in terms of the policy, it's only ever come up once before my time. I think it was related to a building compliance dispute. Not sure if the executive director was still here when that happened. It was before, so it was about 10 years ago, a long time ago. We've never needed the policy to that extent. The city has standing, and you'll see in the budget that we have legal expenses for property matters, land matters, planning matters, and HR, and then general legal matters as well. And we tend to go to different external lawyers under each of those 4 categories of legal advice that we might require.
Can I just say though, that on that line of questioning, it does raise the issue of whether the policy should at least countenance the idea of repayment and in what circumstances, because that's been wholeheartedly removed from the policy. So if administration could potentially consider what would happen in the case where costs were awarded and covered legal fees, or if there is a finding against the employee or councillor,
Yes,
should those costs not be repaid?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole. I mean, that's the intent, but we'll have a look at whether any of that could sit under 5.3. That might make sense. So we'll have a look at that during the week.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Okay. Next is item 8.3, local government statutory compliance audit return 2022. Any questions? And 8.5, financial year 22 Australasian Local Government Performance Excellence Program, key findings of benchmarking report. Councillor Hallett.
Thank you through the Mayor to the CEO. I'm just wondering what actions are being taken to address the overtime issue.
Through Mayor Cole, that has come up over the previous reports as well, and mainly relates to infrastructure and environment. And it does tend to relate largely to extended out of normal hours in parks and also engineering, and a lot of other night works for roads and weekend work as well. So I have asked the acting executive director to look at that, just to make sure that it's not creating the risk of unsafe work practices through fatigue or other ways that we might be managing our workforce. There is another finding related to the fact that we do have, proportionally compared to the benchmark councils, a very low agency spend. So it seems that we're using our own staff to perform overtime during outside normal business hours, night works and weekends, as opposed to contracting agency staff. And I couldn't tell you right now whether or not it's more expensive to pay our staff overtime to work on weekends at night, or to pay the higher cost of an agency staff member to do that. But I think this has been a long-standing practice as far as I can tell from the last 3 reports. We're looking at that mainly through an OSH risk perspective in terms of what hours staff might be working, whether there's a fatigue issue potentially involved.
Councillors, Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick question. I'm happy to be taken on notice. The road operating expense that's double the metro median, does this relate to the ratio, whose name I've forgotten, that we were highly underspending on in previous years? And does that mean we have overcorrected? Or does that simply represent the getting back on track?
It's a different metric. The finding is that per kilometre, City of Vincent's very high. The previous finding that we had discussions with the Federal Department of Transport was around our own source spending on roads compared to the federal grant spending, and that was just how much the split between municipal funding and grant funding, and that was creating an issue with the ratio and the grant requirements. This figure, which is very large, relates largely to the point I just made around being in a city. For every 1 kilometre of road resurfacing, we usually have to do it at night, and it's going to be double the cost of out of suburban areas due to traffic management costs. And I think traffic management costs kill us in just about every aspect of roads, and trying to avoid busy inner city roads for closures during the day.
Councillors, any further questions on this item? Okay, that concludes the items of business to ask questions on this evening. If I could just remind you of where we started at this evening. We talked about providing any amendments in advance of the meeting. That would be incredibly helpful, particularly on the AGME item. That would be very much appreciated if you could submit by Thursday evening, Friday morning. And there have been a few others flagged this evening, so anything that you can provide in advance would help for a efficient meeting. It is a relatively large agenda, so that would be very much appreciated. And yes.
Just when would the briefing notes be received if you want the changes by Thursday?
Through Mayor Cole, so we'll release the final agenda. We'll also have to upload the audit committee minutes, which won't go out until this week as well. So on Friday, we'll send out the final OCM agenda with the briefing notes. If there's a particular issue on any of those items that you're thinking that you might like to move an amendment on, which you're flagged, if you could highlight those. If you could highlight those now, then we could help prepare the draft amendments, and then that would require separate reasoning as well, which we might use some of the information we're already putting together on the briefing notes. So happy to have an advanced meeting or provide the briefing note responses separately to a councillor if it's looking like there might be an amendment on the table, which we'd like to prepare before the end of the week.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I declare the meeting close at 8:58 p.m.